Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by
DHG is a full-service accounting firm serving Memphis and the Mid-South region for more than 60 years, combining community involvement with the technical resources of a national firm. For more information, visit dhgllp.com.
the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Dorsey Hobson and Chris Barbick on the state of education in Memphis tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I am joined tonight by Dorsey Hobson, superintendent of the Shelby County School System. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
And Chris Barbick, superintendent of the Achievement School District. Thanks for being here again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Also, Bill Dries, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. Well, we have to start with you, Dorsey. Big news that we were taping on Wednesday, so last night the school board voted to pursue a lawsuit against the state over funding for BEP, Basic Education Program. You had raised some caution, I think, some months ago, as this has been contemplated. You are a lawyer, former lawyer for the school system. Are you happy that the school system is going to pursue this lawsuit?
Well, I think that no one's ever happy to have to file a lawsuit. But I think at the end of the day, the board just determined that given the lofty achievement goals we've set and given our student population, we have to be funded adequately. I think one of the things that we advised the board on was to give the governor a chance to make this right. And everyone on our school board has a whole lot of confidence in Governor Haslam. And by his actions, he's shown that he's committed to public education and funding public education. But the issue becomes the legislature controls the purse strings. So given some of the dynamics in Nashville, the board felt it prudent to move forward.
And Chris Caldwell, just so we get some sense of what BEP is and the money at stake, Chris Caldwell from the Shelby County School Board, he was on the show recently, and he's been a big advocate for joining this lawsuit. Yeah. I think, is Chattanooga already involved?
Chattanooga has a separate
Nashville
lawsuit.
has said that they may follow they've kind of implied that they may follow what Memphis does. So other school systems may come together in this lawsuit against the state. For Shelby County alone, Chris Caldwell and others calculated it $103 million shortfall in state funding.
And just for some context, Eric, I mean, we have 40,000 kids who live in households where the income is less than $10,000 per year. Right. So we have just an extremely fragile population. And given some of the social and emotional support that a lot of these students aren't getting at home, the reality is that, the school district is in a position where it needs to support these kids emotionally and socially so that they can be better prepared to learn.
Let me go to Bill here for some history on BEP. Basic Education Program has been around. Can you do a 30-second history of it?
It originated during the McWhorter administration, and we've had a series of lawsuits that have changed it. What's in place now is BEP 2.0 is what it's called in shorthand. And it's basically the state formula that determines how much local school districts are going to get from the state, which is the major funder when you include the federal money that comes through the state for local school districts. It's basically a formula that says this is how we determine across all of the different school districts of all different sizes how much that particular school system will get.
Okay. And Chris, let's get you in the mix here. And first, although you've been on the show before, I think a lot of people who follow these things closely understand what the Achievement School District is, but give me your definition and the kind of summary of what the ASD is here in Memphis and statewide, and then we'll get into this lawsuit kind of question.
Sure. Well, the Achievement School District is a statewide school district, and we're focused on what the state defines as the priority schools, and those are schools that are performing in the bottom 5%. So we have this year 23 schools, both here in Shelby County and in Davidson County and Nashville. And our goal is to improve those schools and to eventually return them back to local control.
And so this funding lawsuit, we'll go ahead and say you're in the awkward position if you work for the state. I mean, your group works for the state, but the funding, how would this kind of lawsuit affect the schools you're in charge of now? Well,
our funding's based on the funding that the local district receives. Okay. So we get the same per pupil here in Shelby County that Dorsey and his schools get. If that's raised or lowered, then that impacts our schools.
Okay. funding's a big question in terms of the ASD, as you said, in 23 schools statewide, but how many in Memphis? Right around 20 schools?
We have 22 here.
22 schools here.
Next year we'll grow to 29 schools. 2 of those will be in Nashville, and the remaining 27 will be here.
Okay, and it's a mix of schools that you direct, and then in some you have charter school operators operate
Correct.
those schools
So-
under your guidance.
That's
under your
right.
control.
So just like Shelby County, I mean, they have charter schools and schools that they directly operate. So we're very much the same in that respect. The majority of our schools are schools that we authorize as charter schools. So of the 23 schools that we had this year that we just wrapped up, 18 of those schools were charter schools, and we were directly running 5 of them.
And people, we had some Shelby County School Board members on a month ago, give or take, maybe 6 weeks ago. Some of them raised concerns that at this point, the ASD, there are too many people draining funds. I mean, in a tight budget kind of situation, Race to the Top money, I think, is gone or is going away, which was federal money that passed through the state. I mean, do you see, I mean, it's an obvious question how you're going to answer, but why is the ASD not a drain on local funding?
Well, I see it more as a shift. I mean, when we take a school, we're taking on the full responsibility of educating every child in that school, and the 10,000 students that Dorsey talked about that are living below the poverty level. That's all of our kids based on the neighborhoods that we're in and the schools that we're serving. So we're taking on the hardest to educate kids in the state. The dollars that the district would normally get to educate those kids, when they're no longer educating those students, then those dollars shift to us. And I think the last thing I would say is that the way we've tried to set up our district is to try and really keep a lean central office. So next year we'll push close to 98% of the per pupil funds that we get down to the school level. So I think in some respects, hopefully by doing this, we're actually able to push more resources out to kids in classrooms. And
you, Dorsey, in a tight budget environment, that's just been so strange. I mean, to put it lightly, over the last few years with the consolidation and then breaking off and all the things that have gone through. I mean, is it a problem to have a school district within the school district, that's taking the money for 22 schools?
Well, I think it depends on your perspective. I mean, I start off with the proposition that we just want good schools. And you cannot ignore the fact that in some of our most impoverished neighborhoods, we have schools that are chronically underperforming, and they didn't get like that overnight. And I think that probably as a result of years of neglect, some of these schools got into the conditions that they are in. So if we were to do better and not have schools in the bottom 5%, we wouldn't be having this discussion. Having said that, I know Chris shares my values that we just want to have good schools. And I think that obviously there's some financial repercussions, but I think the good part about this situation is it does create good competition. We have about almost 5,000 fewer kids in priority schools now than we had just 3 years ago. So at the end of the day, this bold approach, while it's uncomfortable and causes tension, I think in the long run it'd be best for kids.
Yeah, Bill.
Let's talk about that dynamic between these two school districts within Shelby County. Are you learning things from each other? Are there approaches that you take with Innovation Schools that he's learning from? Are there things that you see that I mean, what kind of an exchange is there between you two as you kind of look at each other and what you're doing?
I think from my perspective, I think that Chris and I collaborate often on a lot of different things. We haven't really had, I think over the last couple of years, a chance to, do a lot of maybe professional development with both of our staffs and, both of our districts, such that we could really learn best practices from each other. Just because we've had so much going on these last few years. I think the strength and the value of our relationship is that, we're able to have grown men conversations. And sometimes we agree and sometimes we don't. But at the end of the day, we try to make sure all of our decisions are based on what's best for kids. I mean, just for example, I can think back a couple of years ago where Melrose was on the ASD's short list, and they had a strong case for Melrose. So we sat down and said, hey, let me talk about some historical stuff in the Orange Mound community and all that. And Chris, to his credit, stood down, but didn't just stand down and say, okay, so give me a better plan. So we made Melrose an I-Zone school. Fairview, if you remember, Bill, was one of the lowest performing schools in the state. That was on the short list. We said we want to do something innovative and make it Maxine Smith STEAM Academy. Now it's going to be one of the highest performing schools in the state. So I think those kind of the collaborative spirit has been productive.
Chris, from your side of this relationship.
Sure. Well, I mean, I would agree with everything Dorsey said. I think from a sort of learning and sort of what are the tactics that are happening that are creating some of the improvements that Dorsey talked about. I think the biggest thing we're seeing in the I-Zone schools is what can happen when you aggregate talent in one school. So I think what these guys have done a great job of doing, and how they've taken advantage of this freedom and flexibility is, they've taken their best performing teachers and leaders and they've concentrated them in the schools of highest need. And then I think traditionally what happens in a lot of districts is that your highest performing teachers, the minute they can, they run to an easier school out in the burbs where it's a much easier job. And so I think these guys have done a great job of incentivizing the talent to go to where it's needed the most. And as a result, you're seeing some tremendous gains in those schools. And I think overall, I mean, Dorsey talked about the 4,500 fewer kids. I mean, what we're seeing statewide is that students in priority schools across the state are growing 4 times faster than students in non-priority schools. So I think what we're starting to see these first couple of years is getting these schools open, getting these options open. We're seeing early indicators of success, and I think now we can enter a phase of the work where we really can start to sit down and learn from one another.
Mm-hmm. And you'd be amazed, but when you talk about competition, how our I-Zone, led by Dr. Sharon Griffin, she's great, but all of the people in the I-Zone take pride in having a competition with the ASD, and that's a healthy competition, a good competition. But I think that the mantra, or the mantra as it were, is always we're going to do better. And I think when you have all these priority schools and they're competing against each other, and it's lifting student achievement, as Chris said, 4 times higher than across the state, then obviously it's something that we need to keep working at.
Before Bill asks another question, I-Zone schools, Innovation Zone schools, same thing. They're under the Shelby County Schools control. How many are there?
17.
17.
We'll have 19 next year.
17, 19 plus the 21. And how many schools on that priority list in Shelby County?
So I think it's
the bottom 5% is.
Yeah, we started. I mean, this is another, I think, just an important sort of metric to look at to talk about progress. I mean, 3 years ago there were 69 schools in Memphis. When we start the school year next year, there will only be 19 schools on that list that are unaddressed. So 2/3 of the schools are either in the I-Zone, in the ASD, or are making progress on their own.
Okay, back to Bill.
So let's talk about the end game then. Over the next 2 years, those 17 schools, what happens with them? Do you all talk about between now and the end of the second school year to come, where does that go?
Well, the state will rerun the priority list at the end of the 2017 school year. And, we've talked several times and gotten folks in our team together. And, we've set an ambitious goal of, no priority schools when the list gets rerun, and having a meaningful intervention in every single one of those schools between now and 2017. And I think, we just finished up the end of year assessments. We'll get the data back in a few weeks, but, we'll get a chance to see how many of those 19 schools are making progress without an intervention. And I think we both feel confident that by the 2017 school year, for the ones that do need an intervention, whether it's I-Zone or ASD, that we'll be able to do that over the course of the next 2 years, working together and working with the community.
From your vantage point, Dorsey, what happens over these next 2 school years?
I think Chris nailed it. Our team spent a half a day together a few weeks ago and just mapped out, what or how these schools should be addressed. And I think that what we determined was that, as Chris said, we need to have some type of meaningful intervention for all these schools by the time the list gets rerun. And oftentimes, some of the schools, we switch out, get a new principal, a new leader. Oftentimes those schools just do better anyway and end up getting off the list. But I think we're both committed to making sure that all these schools are addressed. And again, when I hear the tension, with ASD and charter schools and all that, I understand that. But at the end of the day, I think that ensuring that the quality of all of our schools go up is more important than turf wars. We had a good meeting last night at the board, and really rich discussion about charter schools and ASD and all that. But I think the consensus is that let's just make sure we have great schools and great options for all of our students, notwithstanding the zip code that they live in.
And just again to clarify, because it's so unlike the old days where there was the school system, when you talk about charter schools, there are how many independent charter schools that aren't part of the ASD or iZone? There are
41.
41. So maybe like Soulsville Academy that people hear about. Those are not ASD schools, not iZone schools, totally separate from this.
So 41 charter schools, about 179 district-run schools, including the 17 iZone schools, and then the 22 schools in the ASD.
Okay. Yeah. And in terms of, we addressed this a little bit. Well, two questions. One is, when let's say it works, an ASD or an iZone school, and it's no longer in that bottom 5%, does it immediately go back to business as usual before, or does it stay in the ASD for a period of time? I mean, because I guess that's always part of the trick, is you get it out of that bottom 5%, but maybe you want to stay with it longer? I don't logistically understand how that works.
Well, I think the short answer is we want whatever changes we're making to be sustainable. I mean, we don't want this to be a flash in the pan where you get results for a few years and then the school starts to slide backwards. The technical answer to that question depends on the type of school. So for the 5 schools that we directly run, the law says that the commissioner would create a transition plan. We would transition those schools back to Shelby County. I think that's something that Dorsey and I have talked about over the course of this next year, is really starting to get a little more specific about timelines. The charter schools are 10-year charters. So when it comes time for the charter to be renewed, then it would go back to Shelby County as a charter school.
I got you.
I think, again, there's some flexibility if all parties agree, us, the district, and the charter, to make that transition within the 10 years. That's something that we have the flexibility to do, but I think that's something that we'll start working on over the course of the next several months.
And we've talked a bit about performance and the test scores and so on. The iZone people were very happy to say that they had in some ways outperformed some of the ASD schools. Does that just, do you just feel competition? Is it back to this idea of competition?
Well, sure, everybody wants to win, but when that happens, we applaud that. I think it's important for folks to remember that both the ASD and the iZone was born out of a statewide initiative. And the idea was that we wanted both a statewide district, but we wanted the local district to be able to have the same flexibility and autonomy we do. So, when we see iZone schools doing well, and tip of the hat to Shelby County, because I think, the way the district has taken advantage of this opportunity, and the way they've taken advantage of the flexibility, it has led to really dramatic student gains, and we think that's a great thing. I think, the last thing I'd say on this is, when we go back and talk about the 69 schools and how we're only down to 19, I don't think that's anything either one of us could have done on our own. Yeah. We don't have the capacity to do that. I don't think the district would have had the capacity to do that either. And to think in 3 short years, we've been able to have that kind of impact, meaningful impact. We've been able to reduce the number of kids going to priority schools. I think it speaks to our ability to yes, we want to win, but we're working together as well.
Yeah, and you're nodding through that, just so people didn't say, Dorsey, but for you, you're in a budget season. You've got money. Am I right in saying that the Race to the Top money is going away this year, or is it the year after? This year?
This is the last year.
So you had gone to the Shelby County Commission for a $14 million increase, in part to replace that Race to the Top money. Yeah. Where do you stand with budgeting, and do you have the money to continue to fund the iZone schools into next year?
Yeah, I think that when you have something that's working, you have to stick with it. And we went through a big strategic planning process, and one of our priorities is increasing the number of high-quality seats in the district. So given that as a priority that the board has adopted and we recommended, and given the fact that the iZone is working, we've got to stick with that. Yeah. The challenge, Eric, was that we lost about $6 million in school improvement grant federal dollars, separate from the Race to the Top. So the question became, so with this $6 million, what do we do? So we just recommended that we just absorb that money and make it a part of our operating budget because it's working. But given that, and then given the loss of some race to the top dollars and some Gates funding money that's going away,
Right.
the budget has been challenging to say the least.
What about on the expense side? I mean, I hear, and if I hear criticism of spending in Shelby County school system, it's people who say, well, the problem there is they've got this bloated central office. I mean, that goes back to, predates you, Kreiner Cash and beyond, back to, people have said that back to when Harrington was superintendent, that that's the problem with what was then the Memphis City schools compared to the Shelby County schools. They had this lean, mean kind of central office, but there's this huge bloat in the back office in Memphis City schools and now still in Shelby County schools. What sort of cuts have happened, or how would you address people who say there's this bloated back office?
So I understand, perceptions and, long histories and that line of thinking, and it takes a long time to move people away from that. But I'd say, during the merger, the TPC, we scrubbed that budget. I mean, the first year between the two districts, we cut $100 million.
Yeah.
The second year, we cut $75 million. And we benchmark our central office versus the Council of Great City Schools, and anything under 3% of a central office staff is considered great, and we're under 3%. We cut every year. I think we cut 367 positions in this budget.
In this
budget, 41 of those were central office positions. So,
out of a staff of how many? Just round numbers.
In terms of
the back office, let's say the administration, how many positions, give or take?
There are about 900.
Okay, so you cut 40 something out of that group.
And then it's so when we talk about that, we talk about, you have to keep in mind people like tradespeople, craftspeople, plant managers, all those are considered central office.
Right.
So it's been a huge reduction over the years. So I think that the best thing for us to do is just to continue to perform and do better, and perhaps we can start to address the perception, because I think at this point that's really all it is.
Yeah. All right, just 4 minutes or so. Bill.
So the county commission has not made its final decision on school funding yet, but their budget committee has recommended $7.9 million in new funding for the school system that they're suggesting the school system use for OPEB liability, put toward that. OPEB is other preferred, other post-employment benefits, a big issue for governments in general. And that the school system possibly pursue the items that you sought on that 15-item list with money from the school system's reserve. If that's their decision, do you know at this point, are you willing to say what you do in terms of reworking your budget?
Well, no, I think what we want to do first is see what they approve. Obviously, OPEB is something that our board is really, really wrestling with, and is really trying to take some tangible actions to address. I mean, I think the irony of this whole thing, Bill, is that, when the demerger happened, the Shelby County schools was left with about $400 million of OPEB liability from the municipal schools. So it's just ironic that we would be giving money to pay the OPEB down. The suburban schools would also get more money too, but they don't have the OPEB liability. And then we have the highest needs kids. But notwithstanding that, I think that you're going to see our board, I think even last night they passed a resolution directing us to fund the OPEB, I think to at least $15 million over the next 2 years. And I think they're going to continue to be more aggressive about funding.
And just to run through the numbers quickly, first of all, go back to something you just said. So Shelby County Schools has all that liability from Memphis City, the legacy Memphis City schools, and the legacy people from the suburban schools.
When the municipal schools formed, they didn't take any OPEB liability.
They didn't take any OPEB liability. That liability is in the range of
$400 million.
$400 million. Right now, the school system puts, I think, is it $30 million a year against that, or is that?
Yeah, we pay as you go. We pay about $30 million, but
Right.
but the ARC says we should be paying about $120 million.
And are you subject? I mean, people who watch the show and follow these sort of things know that the city of Memphis has been going through this process, and there's a state law that I know addressed municipalities and counties that weren't funding their retirement systems and OPEB properly have to move towards that. Are you subject to that same law?
No, we only have to show it, but according to the comptroller, they anticipate a similar law for school districts somewhere in the next 4 or 5 years.
So you know you've got to move in that direction. Okay. Just a minute left here. A real quick thing. Common Core took a beating. The education standards. Chris, your take on what has happened to the Common Core standards in the state of Tennessee, and how does that impact what you all do in the classroom?
Well, I think finally we've given teachers the clarity they need to move forward. So I think the standards for the most part will stay the same. They may change slightly, different name, new assessment, but I know this has been a tough year on teachers where they've had to try and kind of live in both worlds. So I think everyone's looking forward to turning the page and moving forward.
Your sense on Common Core and the changes, what he said.
Ditto, and I also want to just thank our teachers for struggling through this year. Yeah.
And what about vouchers have been an issue that comes and goes in the state legislature. This would really affect you. I mean, what is your stand and the school system stand on vouchers?
We're just going to try to keep making our schools better and become the district
It's
of
the
choice.
one reform in national. It's the one reform that Memphis doesn't have. So I can't imagine.
Yeah, it's
Okay, and the city is starting to pay. It's the settlement that you and Mayor Wharton worked out. You received your first payment. Is that correct?
we did.
Okay.
We did. Yeah.
Yeah.
$8 million. Yeah, and that's going to go a long way towards helping with the ISOL sustainability too.
All right, Dorsey Hobson, Chris Barbic, Bill Dries. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week. Good night.
DHG is a full-service accounting firm serving Memphis and the Mid-South region for more than 60 years, combining community involvement with the technical resources of a national firm. For more information, visit dhgllp.com.